Okay, right. Okay, comrades. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. It's taken more than a decade of work, really, for me to get to the point where we are today, where this book, bringing together writings and speeches by Pat Wall, has finally been published. And as you might know from those of you who might have already read the book, because we've had it published now for a month, then this didn't start out as a project to publish this sort of a book. I started off wanting to write a biography of a figure I felt had been a forgotten hero of the workers' movement, who I'd been inspired by when I joined the Socialist Party, one of the successor organisations to the militant tendency. But that's that's something that to do justice to takes a hell of a lot of work. For someone in the workers' movement, I think you've got to explore every inch of the struggles they were involved in. And Pat Wall was involved in a hell of a lot of class struggles over the year. He joined the Labour Party at just 16 in 1950 and later became the secretary of his constituency Labour Party that same year. He was a branch secretary of several USDAW branches during his working life. He attended conferences of the unions and after a change of work was active in the ASTMS as well. He was a delegate to and member of the executive committee of the Liverpool Trades Council and Labour Party, which was a joint body at the time he was active, and then he was a delegate to Bradford Trades Council, which he was president of for 14 years as well. He spoke in debates at Labour Party conferences throughout the years on some of the most crucial debates that took place. He was elected local councillor in Liverpool and then again in Bingley before being the MP for Bradford North from 1987 until his untimely death in 1990. And that's just some of the formal positions that Pat held, through which he was involved in many different strikes and disputes. And whilst trying to delve into all of that, then I started to accumulate a lot of articles, transcripts of speeches, and so on that I felt deserved to see the light of day again. And that's what we've got in the book, really, is a collection of those with introductions to try and give context to that as well. So, a bit more about Pat's background before we delve into that. Pat was born in 1933. His father was originally from Scarborough, who unemployment drove via various towns to end up in Liverpool. Pat, however, was born in Manchester, where his mum's parents lived. They had both been from Northern Ireland, but grew up on opposite sides of the sectarian divide and ran away to get married and then settled in Manchester as a result. He went to school at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, a grammar school, which was also attended by Paul McCartney and George Harrison of Beatles fame, and they would play at a Young Socialist Valentine's dance in the late 50s, which Pauline Wall, when I spoke to her a few years ago before she passed, assured me was packed out. Pat started school in 1945 and got his first taste of politics proper there in a mock election which Labour won, which in an interview I read Pat said was probably the only time Labour won the mock election at that grammar school. But also the Communist candidate in the mock election withdrew and his 100 supporters went to the Labour candidate there. But that kind of reflected the mood, I think, in society of kind of wanting change at that time. The impact of setting up the national health system in those years had a big impact on Pat's families. His sister, Moira, I think she was called Moira, who was disabled, was able to dispose of a wheelchair that she'd had, which was so heavy it took two people to push. That was something that they'd had to borrow off somebody to use, and got a lightweight one, and then later got more things that allowed her to be mobile and to work, rather than being unable to contribute in that way. Pat joined the Labour Party, as I said, in 1950 when canvassers knocked on his door. When they knocked on the door, they were taken aback by somebody who said to them, "How can I get involved in the campaign?" The canvasser actually marked them down as Tory supporters because of that. And it was only a couple of nights later when Pat and a friend went to the local Labour Party headquarters, they actually got signed up to join. He was encouraged to join the party's youth group at the time, which was called the Labour League of Youth. Pat was actually elected to its national committee in 1953, shortly before that body was shut down. It was through them needing a delegate to their local constituency from the League of Youth in Garston that he became involved and then became rapidly its secretary. Not a ward secretary, a constituency secretary. He was put in touch through that with the Dean family, members of whom were part of the leadership of the League of Youth in the Walton constituency. They produced at that time a journal called Rally, which stood for Read All About the Labour League of Youth, which was later refounded again in the late 50s to campaign after the League of Youth had been shut down for the local youth sections which existed at the time to be able to organise nationally and have a national youth organisation. That journal Rally, there's a couple of pieces from the later version in the book on the youth section of the Labour Party and on Algeria that you can find there. Now, this group that Pat got involved with was one of the fragments of an organisation that had existed during the war called the Revolutionary Communist Party. That was a Trotskyist organisation that had something like 500 members during the Second World War. It played a certain role in leading and supporting strike action that took place under the kind of conditions of during the war truce, where often that was the government at the time and the capitalists at the time used the kind of idea of the need to kind of pull together national sacrifice and that to carry through attacks on wages and conditions to water down workers' standards and so on. And the Revolutionary Communist Party played a role in that and got persecuted for it. 4 of their leaders were actually sent to jail for supporting a strike of apprentices in the 1940s as well. To briefly just explain what Trotskyism was for those who might not be familiar, then that was a movement that originated in opposition to the bureaucratic direction that the Soviet Union was moving in, and indeed the Communist International under Stalinism that developed after the death of Lenin in early 1924. Trotsky had been one of the co-leaders of the 1917 Russian Revolution alongside Lenin, and had founded the Red Army to defend the revolution against the multiple imperialist powers that tried to invade Russia shortly after it. Trotsky stood for workers' democracy in the Soviet Union and revolutionary internationalism in the Communist International, which Stalin's idea of socialism in one country meant a turn away from, leading to defeats of revolutionary struggles in China in the 1920s and Spain in the 1930s, amongst others. Trotsky worked with many others opposed to Stalinism, but through a combination of repressive measures by the Stalin-dominated state machine, threats to families, and the idea that was used to appeal to people of, even in a restricted way, being able to contribute towards the development of the Soviet Union, then numerous of those people Trotsky worked with capitulated to Stalin, only to be rewarded later in the 1930s with being put on the show trials that were carried out in the late 30s, and many of them physically exterminated or sent to internal exile. Trotsky was the main defendant in absentia at those show trials, because in 1929 Stalin exiled him from the Soviet Union. And without going into lots more detail, I mean I can do if people want to ask about it later, what that meant though was that Trotsky was able to link up with co-thinking dissidents from the Communist International elsewhere in the world and form a new revolutionary Marxist movement, which included groups like the Revolutionary Communist Party. Now, to bring us back to Pat and his involvement, the Dean group in Liverpool was really based around a family. Gertie Dean, who'd been active in the Independent Labour Party and so on. Her 3 sons, Arthur, Brian and Jimmy, as well as Brian's wife, Beryl. And that was the main base of that group, which also involved Ted Grant, who was obviously quite prominent in militant as well, and the Revolutionary Communist Party. Pat in interviews said that Jimmy Dean was the single person that had the biggest impact on his political philosophy. He would go and meet Jimmy Dean for discussions at his works canteens on issues from the Popular Front to anarcho-syndicalism and everything else in between. Although that was on the 1 out of 3 times that Jimmy turned up, because he was very unreliable, and Pat felt very embarrassed by the situation he was put in, sat in this works canteen where he'd been told to say trying to remember what it was, but he was told to basically say he was an independent contractor and he could go into the canteen, which was heavily subsidised, and he felt quite embarrassed if Jimmy didn't turn up and he was there sat in this canteen that he wasn't really supposed to be in. But this was an isolated group that Pat joined. In the 1950s and early 1960s, he tried to break out of this isolation by collaborating with others from a similar Trotskyist background. In 1957, they established the Revolutionary Socialist League to try and appeal to dissidents from the Communist Party after the events in Hungary, the revolution movement that took place there in 1956. And in the early 1960s, briefly collaborated in the Young Socialists with a number of groups, including the International Socialists, which is now the Socialist Workers' Party. They produced a journal called Young Guard. That didn't really work out, and you can get a sense of kind of why that's the case if you compare the article I mentioned earlier on Algeria with the other article that's in the book, which was published in Young Guard on Algeria, but it doesn't go into the same depth about what to do about the struggle and so on. But through involvement in struggles such as the 1960s apprentices strike in Liverpool, which was led by the Dean Group and its supporters, then their group began to win a layer of important young members. That included 2 of the 5 expelled editorial board members of the Militant, Keith Dickinson and Peter Taff. And by the way, I'll just mention Keith Dickinson's memoirs are we've got a copy of that at the back if anyone's interested in that, because that talks a bit about some of this period in Liverpool for anyone who's more interested in that. But it also included the late Tony Mulhern, who was one of the leaders of the Liverpool City Council struggle in the 1980s, to name just a few. And with this influx of new members, and Pat, along with them, was one of the founders of the Militant newspaper in 1964, just before the general election. Pat chaired the meeting at which the decision to launch that paper was made at, and was heavily involved in the leadership. He was one of the shareholders of the newspaper until the 1980s, when he had to give it up because of which in the Labour Party. But we'll come on to that in a minute. It was around this time, though, that he moved for a few years to Market Harborough due to work in the mail order industry, where he then became constituency secretary and election agent there, before moving on to this part of Bradford in the Shipley area, where some of his biggest impact on Labour Party conferences would be as a delegate from that area. Now, a number of the speeches that Pat gave at Labour Party conferences are in the book, but I want to draw attention to 2 of them that I think had particularly wider impact in the sort of what those speeches and kind of what the decisions taken at the conference and what it led to. Firstly, his speech at the 1972 conference on public ownership, and whilst that was watered down from kind of Militant's position at the time for nationalising the top 250 monopolies in order that they could be democratically run and planned and organised to provide for people's needs. That debate led to the inclusion of nationalising the top 25 companies in Labour's 1974 Labour's manifesto. Secondly, his speech at the 1979 conference in support of mandatory reselection became eventually agreed at a special conference. Prior to that, there'd been a somewhat Byzantine system that required multiple meetings to decide if you wanted to change your MP, and that was instead replaced by a system where ahead of a general election, constituencies would have an open selection meeting. So people would just put themselves forward to be nominated to one meeting, and that would decide who the candidate was. And it was under that system that Pat was selected in 1983 and 1987 to contest Bradford North. Pat was also known for being a top-notch public speaker. He was in high demand, speaking at events around the country. If people have whatever flick through old issues of Militant, like almost every issue, there's an advert for Pat Wall speaking at some either Militant public meeting, Labour Party public meeting, Young Socialist meeting, trade union meeting, more. And those were not just on immediate issues, which many of them were, some of the things that he spoke on at the conference and are in the book, but it was also on theoretical topics. And we've got one of those in the book on what is socialism, which was from a Labour Party Young Socialist Day School in Liverpool. There's also a recording of Pat speaking on the Hungarian Revolution that we put on YouTube as well, that people can listen to. Unfortunately, it's incomplete. Otherwise, if I've got the complete thing, I'd got a transcript of that and put it in the book as well. Pat was also a lifelong trade unionist, and which is part of the reason we have been able, wanting to work with Bradford Trades Council to put on this event today. His first job was in a cattle food factory as a chemist, but following his national service based in Preston, with a year in Germany where he marched in support of the Hungarian Revolution, he got a job in the mail order industry instead and became a delegate from Ulster to Liverpool Trades Council and Labour Party. Pat played an important role in helping develop a base of support in Ulster for Militant. He spoke at the first public meeting Militant held at the union's annual delegate meeting, and was a branch secretary in both Liverpool and then in Bradford. As I mentioned, he ended up in the ASTMS, which is now part of Unite. The position that Pat is, of course, most known for in the trade union movement was being the president of Bradford Trades Council. When Pat first attended the Trades Council as a delegate, there was just him and another militant supporter on that body, but by consistently putting forward a clear programme and policy of what he thought the trade union movement should put forward, policies that he won support for already in his trade union branch, then in Pat's words, that won support from activists, and in Pat's words, much to our surprise, we were approached by some of the best non-cliqued members of the council to contest the presidency against the dictatorial, undemocratic rulings of the CP president. This was a position that Pat went on to hold from 1973 for 14 years until he was elected an MP in 1987. Now, one of the documents in the book that kind of deals with this a bit is a piece that Pat wrote for a Militant Industrial Bulletin. That was an internal document. It was where he set out his thoughts on how he thought Marxists should organise themselves on trades councils, primarily drawing from his experience in Bradford, but also in Liverpool in the past, and setting down how do you work when maybe not everybody's going to agree with you? How do you help create an atmosphere that allows for debate and discussion and tries to take the movement forwards? And obviously, there was many initiatives taken by the Trades Council in Bradford when Pat was president, including conferences to discuss strategies to fight against redundancies in the district, strategies to fight against cuts to public services, as well as building wider support for workers in struggle and supporting or helping to organise strike rallies for workers, which really is the bread and butter, I would say, of what a trades council should do. Pat, and today's meeting is fully in the tradition as well that was established at that time, because Pat took a history and the interest in the history of the workers' movement as well. I think that can be seen in the book in a couple of the articles which Pat wrote for the Militant newspaper on the 1929 to 31 Labour government, and also on the history of witch hunts in the Labour Party. Bradford North Constituency Party, Constituency Labour Party, supported by the Trades Council, held events to mark the 90th anniversary of the founding of the Independent Labour Party in Bradford. That was a precursor of the Labour Party, and of the 1896 by-election when Keir Hardie stood for Parliament in Bradford East, unsuccessfully at the time, but had was an important step at that time. But one of the major initiatives they took early in Pat's tenure was to take up the growth of the far-right National Front in Bradford. They established an anti-racism subcommittee. An important step is tackling the far right, shouldn't be the job of just volunteers and so on, but of the Labour movement as a whole, and mobilising the whole of the Labour movement to do that. This is both on the grounds of the threat the far right posed to attempt to smash the workers' movement, but also to need to mobilise the overwhelming weight of the working class to stop divisive racist marches, and link that to a programme for social transformation to tackle the underlying inequalities and inequities rooted in the capitalist system, which racist ideas are posed as a way of solving by blaming particular sections of workers. A counter-demonstration to a march by the National Front in May 1974, who had started holding meetings in Bradford around that time, was called by the Labour Party Young Socialists and supported by the Trades Council. That, as far as I know, was the first national demonstration against the National Front, which was called by the official bodies of the Labour movement. But this event didn't go without incident. Two militant supporters who were carrying the Trades Council banner, who were a little isolated from the main demo, were attacked by the National Front supporters, and the Trades Council banner was destroyed in that attack. In writing a report in Militant about this, which is in the book, Pat not only outlined the way the police stood by and let this happen, and then the courts let off the two people eventually apprehended for this was simply being bound over. But he used this as an example to explain the role of the capitalist state. He explains at the end of the article, in a class society, justice serves the interests of the exploiting class. It's entirely utopian to believe that the menace of racialism and fascism can be dealt with by the courts. Only the mobilisation of the enormous strength of the labour movement around a clear socialist programme to transform society can provide a guarantee against reaction. But this issue of the state was another issue that ran right through Pat's life. In the book's appendices, there's a letter from Bill Thompson, who was at canvasser. I mentioned in the letter, he doesn't mention that he put Pat down as a Tory voter, by the way. So I found out from a few interviews elsewhere. But he mentions the first motion that Pat put forward to go to the Labour Party annual conference, which included the demand for democratic control of the armed forces by workers through elections by the ranks of the army of their officers. And that wasn't put forward as some abstract thing. That was put forward because, in a very practical way, because young men at the time, such as Pat, were due to be called up for national service. So, they didn't want to be bossed around by officers who had a totally different outlook to them. But it was in raising some of these points in a debate with the Socialist Workers' Party in 1982, which was secretly recorded by a journalist from the Sunday Times, that Pat became an even more nationally known figure when a sensationalised account of his speech appeared in the press, with Pat being posed as being hell-bent on bloodshed and civil war. And what Pat had actually said in the course of that debate was, in contrast to those who insist on revolutions being inherently violent affairs, then Marxists were in favour of a peaceful transition to a social society based on public ownership and democratic workers' control and management of the economy. The threat of civil war came from the capitalist class, faced with dispossession of their wealth and power, which could only be countered on the basis of the full power of the workers' movement being mobilised. The relatively recent example of the fate of the Allende government in Chile in 1973 made that very clear, and that was a point that was mentioned in Pat's speech, but not reported in the articles in the press. Pat also recognised that the role of the state was not just the armed bodies of men, which was Engels' term, but also the role of the media as part of the state apparatus to maintain the status quo. He was hounded at that time, with photographers camped outside his house, to the extent that his wife Pauline had to put up the NUJ's Code of Professional Conduct outside their house in order to remind them of that. And if you want to hear Pat speaking on that issue, then there's a recording of him on the Any Questions radio show on YouTube. And in that clip, Pat explains that private ownership of the mass media is used as a tool to aid the agenda of the parties representing the interests of the capitalist media moguls. As he states in that, he felt that it could only be challenged in the first instance by building our own working class media, but in the second instance by fighting for public ownership of the mass media and the allocation of print and broadcasting resources democratically based on popular support for those ideas. Now, given Pat's authority in Bradford as Trades Council President, then he was a natural person for workers to want to put up when they wanted to challenge the right-wing MP, Ben Ford, in Bradford North. This battle to win this seat would span two general elections, having to fight not just the Tories, as you would expect, who used the Sunday Times recordings in one of their election broadcasts in the run-up to the 1987 election, but it was also fought against those supposed to be on Pat's side, on the workers' side, the right wing of the Labour Party. Pat's initial victory in the selection battle was forced to be rerun after the Sunday Times report, with Labour leader Michael Foot being quoted in the press as, who was regarded to be on the left, but he was reported in the press and quoted to say that it would be unwise to select Pat. Despite this, Pat was reselected with even a bigger majority at the rerun reselection meeting. But refusing to accept defeat twice, Ben Ford then stood in the general election as an independent Labour candidate, along with an SDP candidate, and as well as Foot, when he spoke at the Eva Poll rally in Bradford with Pat and the other Bradford Labour candidates, made points in that about needing to abide by the whip, which were instantly picked up in the press and magnified again to use it as a kind of red scare on him. Then that did enough damage to the Labour vote to see the Tories win by a 1,600 majority. Ben Ford, I think, took 4,000 votes. The SDP took a bit less than that as well. So you can see how the Tories were able to sneak through the middle. But Pat and other people fought again to win this election ahead of the next general election and succeeded to win the 1987 election by a similar margin to what he was defeated by in 1983. But more battles were to come. A new witch hunt against militant supporters in Bradford North was launched almost immediately after the election, whilst another battle was waged against the right-wing Labour group on the council who refused to rent Pat an office in the City Hall, a battle that took 7 months to win. Despite these hurdles, Pat was reselected again to contest the next election as the Labour candidate. However, such was the spiteful nature of some of these people on the right, then these attacks continued, even when Pat was in his hospital bed less than a month before passing away. He had to write from his hospital bed, objecting to attempts to undermine his parliamentary staff in the office. You can tell his pride in some of the people he had assisting him in fighting for the workers' interests. He said of Howard Oakes, one of his secretaries, "We had little money in the kitty and the work was expanding, so I offered Howard temporary work. Since then he's become almost indispensable." And he felt similarly about his other parliamentary researchers and secretaries and so on. You can tell from that. And unfortunately, after his election as well, the Labour Council leadership again tried to go into his office, take his records away, and so on, rather than allow his staff to wind down the office. Pat stuck to his promises, though, while he was an MP. He was accountable to the movement. He produced an annual report and many other supplementary reports in between. There's copies in a yellow kind of file, I don't know what to call it, at the back there if people want to have a look at those. The introduction to all 3 of those reports, though, those annual reports are in the book as well. And like the other 2 militant supporting MPs, Dave Nellis and Terry Fields, Pat was a workers' MP on a workers' wage and reported on his workers' wage and how much he was actually taking, where his expenses were going, and so on and so forth like that in those annual reports to remain accountable to the members who and the people who'd elected him in the Labour Party and the trade unions. He also took part in the mass struggle of non-payment of poll tax, speaking at lots of anti-poll tax union meetings. He was amongst a couple of dozen Labour MPs who pledged to support non-payment of the poll tax. That stand which led to the jailing of Terry Fields and over 100 other people around the country for non-payment, but did in the end help bring down the Thatcher government. As he was an MP, he was active on many other issues as well, some of which are in the book, but I'll just talk a little bit about some of the international issues that he took up as well. That was important because, not least because he was the MP for Bradford North, an area with a large Pakistani and Kashmiri communities, and took up issues relating to that. In particular, the question of the rights of migrants. He opposed extensions of visa requirements for people visiting, and so on. But he also spoke in Parliament about the brutal dictatorship under Pinochet in Chile, and personally, I think this was something that the Trades Council organised in Bradford, took in refugees from Chile. He spoke on both the Tiananmen Square massacre and the crisis of Stalinism in Eastern Europe in 1989, all of which are included in the book. And if he hadn't been ill in 1990, then he had intended to speak in Pakistan that year to mark the 50th anniversary of Trotsky's assassination as well. Pat, I've talked a lot about Pat's politics. He wasn't all politics, though. He had hobbies as well. He included walking. He followed sport as a big Everton fan, but he also followed Bradford Northern Rugby League when he moved here. He was a big fan of jazz, particularly Charlie Parker, and ran an annual jazz night at a mail-ordered buyers' convention in the Midlands he had to attend for work. There is a story somewhere, I've been trying to track down where I've seen it, but that when all the thing kicked off on the selection and that he was tried to be tracked down by some of the press and that, and they've kind of got hold of the hotel he was staying in. But when they rang the hotel said, "Oh, he's putting on a jazz night," and they thought, "Oh, it can't be it. That can't be this militant person if he's into jazz," which I thought was quite amusing. But there's a piece by Pat on Charlie Parker in the book as well, which I think is quite interesting as well. But to finish, really, Pat was a fighter for the working class all his life. He was driven by his detestation of the misery inflicted on humanity by the rotten, exploitative system of capitalism. But even more so, he was driven by his vision of a socialist future on the basis of ordinary people taking control of the economy that dominates their lives and organising it on a democratic basis to instead meet the needs of all. And that's something that I, and I hope many of you here, will take inspiration from Pat and will continue to fight for as well.
Thank you.